So, the federal budget, $280 billion in overall spending, a $78.3 billion deficit. Then we have Ontario's fall economic update, around $235 billion in spending and a $13.5 billion deficit. That's how it shakes out on a spreadsheet. But what do those numbers actually mean? What can they tell us about our government's real priorities, and are Ottawa and Queen's Park on the same page? I got some insight from TVO Today's John Michael McGrath. John Michael McGrath, welcome to the program. I feel like you're everywhere. TVO.org, on Poly, and now you're officially on the Rundown. This looks probably a little familiar to you.
Yes, same room, dressed slightly differently, but happy to be here.
TV magic.
Yes.
Nobody needs to know. All right, let's start with the Ontario economic update. What were the sort of big differences between this release versus, let's go back to the spring, 2025?
So it's a $13.5 billion deficit, which is slightly smaller than what the government was projecting earlier this year in the spring. That's primarily being driven by stronger than expected tax revenues, and they've held the line more or less on spending. It has not grown very much. That said, there are some storm clouds that the government is worried about, economic trouble. The economy has already contracted slightly in the previous quarter, and we're not projecting an outright recession, which is like 2 quarters of consecutive shrinkage, but they are concerned about that, and so there's a lot of money in this budget, this fall economic statement for supporting workers, supporting businesses, helping to diversify Ontario trade, that kind of thing.
All right, you talked about budget. Let's show some graphs, actually. This is looking at the federal budget's 2025 projected deficits. If we start on the left, you'll see $78 billion for the 2025-26 year. You can see that dark number there. That is the capital investment, which we will talk about. And then as you move down to the right, $65 billion to the next, and then we gradually fall to $57 billion. So how does Ontario's deficit projections compare with those we saw in the federal budget?
Well, it's smaller to begin with. Of course, the Ontario budget is smaller than the federal one, but the deficit is much more manageable provincially than it is federally, and the way you can tell that is that Ontario is hoping to have its budget more or less balanced within 2 years' time. That is not the case federally. We just saw in that chart deficits more or less as far as the eye can see, federally speaking. Now, the type of deficit is going to change if the federal government's plans go the way they want to.
How so?
They are looking to really shift the deficit from funding the sort of the day-to-day operations of the government, which is more or less what is happening now, and really hoping to shift that into longer-term capital investments. This is what Prime Minister Mark Carney means when he says he wants the government to spend less but invest more. And so they are looking at big capital projects, things like the always promised, never built high-speed rail between Toronto and Montreal, that kind of thing.
All right, actually, let's pull up another chart here. This is the capital investments, historical and projected. You can see on the left side from 2020, 2021, a bit lower, around $10 billion to about just under $30 billion. And then we see these bigger numbers. Now, should be important to mention historical versus projected. Will those numbers, when we're looking at this chart, will that change drastically? Just looking at sort of what historical versus projected?
Yeah, and so I guess there's 2 things to say there. You can see that the capital spending has been heading up slowly in prior years, but that doesn't explain the deficit. The deficit has overwhelmingly been driven by a very large increase in spending since COVID-19 in particular. The future increases, that's really where we're going to see whether the federal government can really meet its promises in terms of getting capital spending out the door. And, this ties into things that Mark Carney has been talking about faster approvals for federal projects, that kind of thing. Both the provincial and federal government have introduced legislation to really streamline approvals, that kind of thing. And so far, we've seen some small steps in that direction. The next several years, of course, we're going to see whether the federal government can match an increase in spending with faster approvals and actually get things built faster.
All right. Both governments announced more money for capital and infrastructure projects, as you mentioned. What did they say about support and funding for skilled trades? Obviously, lots of headlines around that. perhaps the Ontario government would say not the greatest headlines, but
Yes.
what kind of supports are there for jobs, for investment, and that will be required?
Yeah, so like nothing gets built without somebody putting a nail in a
Right.
2x4 somewhere, and so both governments are making lots of money available to help support skilled trades. Now you alluded to the Skills Development Fund that the provincial government has. This is something like $1.5 billion that the government has dispersed to various groups over the last several years. That is staying at its current level of funding in the current fall economic statement. No changes there. Now, no changes for better or worse, because, of
right.
course, it has been a bit of a scandal for the last several weeks because it turns out that some of the recipients of that money have been politically aligned with the government, and they have then turned around in some cases and spent that money on lobbyists who are themselves close to the government. So bit of a scandal there. The government, of course, denies any impropriety. We should say that. Federally, the budget does include $75 million for what they're calling the Union Training and Innovation Program. This is also intended to help support skilled trades, and particularly, as the name implies, unionized skilled trades. So, you can see both governments are very alive to this notion that they want to get things built, that building things is going to require skilled workers. For many years, both federal and provincial governments around Canada have been very worried about a wave of retirements shrinking our skilled trade labor force. So this might arguably be overdue. Again, I think we will see how this plays out. I think certainly provincially there's been a lot of success in recruiting people into the skilled trades, and one of the prior labor ministers was very, very passionate about what he said, like removing the stigma of the skilled trades, getting high school kids to think of the trades as an alternative to solely going into university. They are working on this, and this is obviously a priority for both levels of government.
JMM, we are going to leave it there. Thank you for that quick 101 on the Ontario Economic Fall Update and the budget.
Thanks for having me.